So welcome to this year's AMSSA talk on climate change, displacement, and environmental racism, everyone. I can see that you are trickling in. Welcome to the AMSSA talk. This event is funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. And my name is Julie Ship, AMSSA's Language Program Manager, and I will be your AMSSA host and moderator for this event. Typically, the AMSSA talk is an armchair style chat with our experts and with service providers and service provider experts, of course, on a particular topic by request, but this year things are slightly different. Before going any further, I would like to acknowledge the privilege that I have as a settler on this land. And this land that I live and work on is the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The Hunkaminam word for change, as I found on First Voices, is iakt. Iakt. And I'm thinking I'm getting it okay for a first timer. And I think this is going to be a key word to keep in mind for the talk today. If you'd like to learn more Hunkaminam words, please visit First Voices. You can see the website on the slide there. So now, I'd like to pass it over to Cherry Fernandez of South Okanagan Immigrant and Community Services, who facilitated a great discussion on climate change, displacement, and environmental racism.
All right, well, hi everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Cherry Fernandez with the South Okanagan Immigrant and Community Services, or SOICS for short. We are a settlement agency that offers settlement services, language instruction, and we also host the local immigration partnership. We serve the South Okanagan Similkameen, and I am joining you today within the ancestral and traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx people of the Okanagan Nation. Thank you. And if you can each introduce yourself, and maybe what I'll do is I'll go around based on what I see on my screen. So Nicole, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Great, thanks, Cherry. My name is Nicole Bates-Emer. I am on the Lekwungen territory in Victoria, British Columbia. I am a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria, where I am exploring the intersections between climate change and human mobility. And I'm also working with an NGO in Vancouver called the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project that's trying to build awareness and capacity about the intersections between climate change and migration. So thanks for having me.
Wonderful, thank you, Nicole. And Bryanna, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
My name is Bryanna Brown. I am both Inuk and Mi'kmaq from Happy Valley Goose Bay, Labrador, currently living on the unceded Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa. I am a Labrador land protector. I am also a business intern at Kapitiak, which is a Indigenous to Indigenous business network, and that also sells coffee. I am also an Indigenous community support worker working in anti-human trafficking. And I am on the Indigenous Climate Action Steering Committee. So today I will be representing Indigenous Climate Action. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Bryanna. David?
Thanks, Jerry. Hi, everyone. I work for Health Emergency Management BC, which is a program within the Provincial Health Services Authority. Probably my more relevant background is previous to some of the work I'm doing here. I did my master's degree looking at patterns of adjustment and coping amongst different refugee populations in Winnipeg. And then as my PhD dissertation looked at riverbank erosion displaces in Bangladesh. I think that has really framed a lot of my thinking. And then over the past, I guess 10, 15 years, it's been a mix of humanitarian programming, emergency management, climate change, but always really very much focused on people in different circumstances. Thanks very much, and I really look forward to this conversation.
Wonderful, thank you, David. So thank you for being here today to join this conversation. I'm really looking at this conversation as a start, because in the settlement sector, migration and displacement as it relates to climate change is not really happening right now. There's not a lot of attention on this topic. So it really is a start. Nicole, can you maybe tell us, with your PhD, you're exploring how we understand the intersections between climate change and migration. What are some of your findings coming from your work?
Thanks for that question, because you know, just as you're saying, this is the start of a conversation for the settlement service. I'm really interested in making sure that we're having the right conversations about this topic. And what that means is really understanding the very complex ways in which climate change intersects with migration. So I think it's easy to be kind of captive to this narrative about climate refugees or mass migration, but that really misunderstands the way in which these two things intersect. So the first thing I want to make, maybe 3 points that are kind of some key learnings. And the first is that this intersection is very complex. Migration is multi-causal, it's context specific, it depends on, you know, individual circumstances. And so the way in which climate change intersects with drivers or factors of migration, like social, political, economic, environmental, demographic drivers of migration, they change the relationship between those drivers and the decision to move. So it's not that we can isolate climate change as the driver of migration. It's that it changes the existing factors that determine why people move or how people make decisions about moving. So, I mean, a really clear example is if we look at people in the global south, the vast majority of people work in agriculture or in subsistence farming, and you cannot disentangle the patterns of rain from their income, right? Because their income is dependent on the weather. And I mean, in Canada, that doesn't happen to the same extent, but in the vast majority of places around the world, people's income and their livelihood is closely tied to the weather. So when those people move to a city or to a bigger town to search for a new job, we might be calling them economic migrants, but that misunderstands the way in which climate change and changing precipitation patterns and droughts and floods and desertification that are all kind of climate impacts intersects with those movements. So we need to get away from this idea that we need to isolate climate change as the driver and better understand how it's intersecting with all of these other drivers. The second thing is that this is none of the empirical evidence that we have so far suggests that there is going to be a mass migration from the global south to the global north. The majority of displacement is within countries. It's within regions. It's often from rural to urban areas, like the example of the farmer going to the town looking for a different kind of livelihood. And so we need to get away from this kind of threat frame or security frame that there is a risk to receiving destinations or places like Canada because there's going to be an influx of climate refugees. That is just not, that is not the way this is going to play out. But the third thing I want to make a point is that what climate change does is it really kind of it problematizes or it makes a problem of this distinction that's so crucial in migration and protection policy around forced versus voluntary migration, right? So we often think about economic migrants as voluntary or making a choice to move, whereas people who are displaced by conflict are forced and have less agency. And what climate change does is that it entirely blurs that forced voluntary binary that protection policies and our own migration policies rely on. So we need to kind of rethink the way in which climate change is intersecting with these other factors and the different policy tools that we have available to protect the rights of those who are on the move, but at the same time, build resilient and inclusive communities where people are most vulnerable to climate change.
Dave, from your experience and maybe in a humanitarian context, what might we consider in Canada? And your work with the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, how would that connect here?
If I could just comment on some of Nicole's points, it strikes me what Nicole is saying is it's not black and white, and there's this tendency to look at things as black and white, and we really have to look at it from a very specific context that climate change has an impact, but it's not the only impact. And there's a lot of other aspects that come into play. And I think the work that I've done within the United Nations, but also within NGOs around the world and here, I think it speaks to that point, is that we really need to understand what is most important. And every situation is different. People come with different vulnerabilities, but they also come with different resiliencies as well. And I think that's a really clear point. But if I think the most important thing of whatever I see in every situation is that people need to be the center of our discussions. If we don't really listen to the people and understand their specific context, then it's really difficult to understand and how best to support them. I think it's also really important if we say we support people, it is with them, and it's really important to be inclusive and be participatory across communities and respectful of the capacities, respectful of their culture, respectful of Indigenous wisdom. Then we start getting the answers around that. And the third thing I've taken away from my work and experiences that I think applies as much as any place in the world is about dignity and respect. And I think if we approach any discussion in any circumstance with that commitment that it is people first, and the only way that we can have that real equal relationship is to put dignity and respect at the forefront of that. To me, that lays the foundation of the discussions, of the answers, because the answers really come from dialogue. And I really do believe that people have the answers themselves. We don't have the answers for them. They have to come from the people. So those are my takeaways from the work that I've done, and that I think is similar regardless of the circumstance and the situation that we might find ourselves.
Thank you. I'd like to share, like, for us in the settlement workers, when we're working on the ground, we see the inequalities, and we talk about having everyone at the table. And it's interesting because for us here at SOIX, we do have an Indigenous educator that comes and educates not only our clients and our newcomers, but also our team about the local Indigenous communities, the history, the land, the culture. And my first time being introduced to environmental racism came out of one of these sessions. And our Indigenous educator had talked about in the past, the Indigenous communities had, they took care of the land, and they did this, part of doing this, they would have controlled fires. But because of the government and the restrictions, they were prohibited from to practice this this regular maintenance of the land with controlled fires. And as many people know, the Okanagan, we were known for wildfires. And like Nicole said, it displaces people. In our case, it is temporary, but people are displaced because of these uncontrollable wildfires that seem to happen now regularly every year. And there is only now a recognition that, you know, our local Indigenous community knew the land. They knew how to take care of it. And so they're kind of coming back to that and reintroducing some of these practices. But of course, there has been a lot of damage done already. Bryanna, can you maybe add to this and talk a little bit about your work with the Indigenous climate change and your land back project?
Hi, for sure. I had came up with land back back in 2019. I was the first person to start that movement, and I had no idea at the time that it would manifest and grow into something that is global. For me, land back was made to promote and advocate for sovereignty in Indigenous peoples, as well as Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. and land ownership as a means of environmental protection. When we talk about land back, we do not necessarily mean to have the land taken from those who are owners of land right now in North America. What we mean more so in terms of having land back in our, I guess, not so much possession, but I guess in a way, our possession is more so viewed with the idea that nobody owns the land. But it is ours to protect. And I think when Indigenous people are talking about land back, that's what their intentions are and what they mean. And I think that gets that can be misunderstood sometimes. The statement of land back was also acted as a statement to push forward the global fight towards social justice and stimulate Indigenous economy, as many Indigenous land protectors across the world use land back on traditional clothing, blankets, jewelry, beading, and just different artwork. Also, land back, a Yellowhead Institute red paper by Ryerson University is a paper that, a report that was written about land back. And it discusses reclamation of land and consent-based jurisdiction, Indigenous peoples leading in the midst of the ongoing climate crisis, displacement of Indigenous people on the land, as well as how Indigenous consent is ignored, coerced, negotiated, and enforced. They also have a website where there are tools and resources, including fact sheets, overviews, and infographics. So seeing how land back had manifested after I had wrote it on a sign when I came from Calgary to Ottawa to protest the mega dams that run along the Churchill River. That is when land back had started. And at the time we were protesting against the mega dams because they are causing flooding in many Indigenous communities near these dams. And there is also a risk of flooding in the community that I am from, where there is the Muskrat Falls Nalcor Energy Project, hydro project there. And there has been no proper inspection or assessment of how the Muskrat Falls hydro project will impact the environment.
So I just want to pick up on a couple of points that Bryanna made that also kind of relate to what Dave was saying. And that is, you know, this idea, and this is what we're seeing even in the climate migration literature. And I did a project looking at BC, and that is that with climate change and climate impacts, we really need to look at the local scale, right? So it's great to have these international frameworks or these federal frameworks, but the people who live in the communities, whether they're Indigenous communities or non-Indigenous communities, they know those communities best, right? They know what is happening on those lands. And for Indigenous peoples, that is generations and generations of knowledge that has been passed down. Even in non-Indigenous communities, there is a rich knowledge in those places about how climate change is impacting their place and their homes and their communities. And so whether it is beyond Canada's borders or whether it's in our own communities, this level of scale and engaging voices of people who are most impacted is so important, because we are not going to be able to build resilient communities, or you know, we need to we need to respect and give pride of place to Indigenous voices who have stewardship over the land and who know that land. And so in terms of centering people, you know, thinking about how this is going to play out in Canada and beyond isn't about high-level policy. It's about working with people on the ground who know both what they are vulnerable and resilient to, and how those vulnerabilities or resiliencies play out in a very dynamic and unpredictable climate.
I also believe that's very, very important to think about when coming up with climate change solutions. It's definitely important to be more inclusive of those who are often left out of decision making areas or tables and processes. So I believe that that's really, really important. And I think that's another reason that I had come up with Land Back, and I have been active in contributing to the conversation surrounding Land Back. And something that had been recently happening is that those who are empowering the Land Back movement are also recognizing the importance of Black Lives Matter and Black indigeneity, as those who are Black and Indigenous and hold both ancestries are able to bridge the gap between Indigenous as well as Black people, so that we are able to come together in this climate change fight, as well as the fight towards social justice. And it's really, really important that we lift each other up in these times and amplify each other's voices. And I noticed that something that's really pushing these movements forward is social media. So I believe that that's a great way and a great place to learn about what's happening with the Land Back movements, as well as the empowerment of Indigenous people, Black people, people of color, and Black Indigenous people, because these are people that are often left out and are impacted typically the most by climate change. So I think when dealing with racism, it's important to consider that the racism that oppressed populations and communities face can also be environmental. So understanding when we are fighting against injustices, it's not to further divide, it's meant to be for us to come together more and to find solutions, and also to fight the divide as well. It's not meant to further divide people, and we're meant to be working together. And I think that this is really important in terms of coming up with solutions as well, because our capitalistic type of society, where there is much consumerism and individualism, is very much encouraged in our society. Because if we're individuals purchasing our own phone, our own car, our own apartment, everything, that increases sales, of course, and then therefore we are causing further an increased consumption. So coming back together in communities and getting rid of these divisive notions and rules is really, really important. And I think that a lot of people sometimes don't fully understand that with these movements, that's something that we are trying to do. It's not meant to be hurtful or negative. It's just a movement where we're having these very necessary but sometimes uncomfortable conversations just to understand each other and to build better connections with one another, and hopefully with the environments around us.
Can I just build on a quick point? And I can't say this is my thought. I actually was listening to CBC, and there's a podcast, and it really made me sit back. And I think it relates to Bryanna, as your point, and also Nicole's. But I think one of the challenges is, how do we understand each other's viewpoints? And I really wish I could remember the reference. I went and I bought the book immediately. But she was speaking about climate and how we view climate. And so many of us, and myself included, we often, and it's a structural viewpoint, is, we think of nature and the climate as being here for us, right? And we try to manipulate it, right? And we do we put in mitigation measures, in emergency preparedness, we do all of these things. But still, we sort of think that it's all here for us, right? And alternatively, we are part of nature, and nature and climate has huge impacts. And if we don't find a way to recognize that and to accommodate ourselves to nature, there's going to be immense consequences. And as we see, that's happening already with climate change. But I think that same understanding of how we view nature, we should also be recognizing that we come from different perspectives. And and taking that time to understand, as you were saying, Bryanna, understanding that perspective. And again, it's not against, it's not for, it's really a different viewpoint. And I think that's something that we often don't take that time to understand. We try to fit other viewpoints into our viewpoints rather than recognizing that it is a distinct viewpoint. And we have to take that time to understand how those viewpoints come together, or in fact, change our own view.
Thank you, David. I think I'm hearing it reiterated here in this conversation that we really do need to get all the different voices together, because it is a complex issue. But I kind of want to open this up and talk about access. How do we do that? For example, when you take a look at, well, when we're thinking of climate crises, health services, those should be there to support when there is an issue that has happened. Now, our access to healthcare, it's not all equal. We see this in the settlement services with the newcomers that we help to support. One example is when trying to find a family doctor. It's very difficult. And there is a pool where newcomers can put their names in. And we have, for example, one couple, one has a very English sounding name. The other, the wife, has a name that sounds foreign. They both put their name. Actually, in fact, the wife put her name in first. Didn't get a call, so they thought, you know what, let's try getting the husband's name in there. The husband got a call and was connected to a doctor very shortly afterwards. The wife to this day has not got a call. So there's an inequality in getting access. I don't know if that's maybe something one of you can speak to, because we are trying to bring the voices together. How do we address something where we see these inequalities in our system?
I think in terms of healthcare, one thing that might be very helpful that I often think about is perhaps moving how doctors are paid from a fee-for-service compensation to a salary-based compensation. I was reading at work at Tunisivinga Inuit the statistics of how many Inuit visit the hospital per year compared to non-Indigenous, non-Inuit people. And the numbers are about 30 times per year for Inuit compared to 2 times per year for non-Indigenous people. And I just wonder, why are these numbers so high, and for Inuit specifically, and why are we having to visit the doctor many more times? And then when I think of that, I also think about the time when I was hit by a vehicle in a pedestrian vehicle accident in my first year of university about 3 years ago. I had so much trouble trying to get healthcare services at the time, which really, really impacted my life and my health. And when I was hit by the car, I went to the doctor. They lifted up both of my legs to make sure they weren't broken, and pressed on my stomach to see if there was any internal bleeding, and then just sent me home. And later on, when I had tried to go and access healthcare services, every single time that I went, the doctors had assumed that I was intoxicated because I was imbalanced in my walking because I was hit in my right hip by the vehicle. It was a taxi van. And the whiplash was so bad that my jaw was dislocated, and that was causing a lack of fluid to go into the side of my face. And then there was an infected bolt just sticking out of the inside of my jaw for a really, really long time, because each time I went to the doctor, they assumed that I was either drunk or high. And I don't think the fact that I'm Indigenous helped at all whatsoever. And then because of these issues and having so much trouble breathing and being dizzy, I was, the doctors assumed that I was drunk or high, and I also had trouble completing my university, so I had to medically drop out of school. And I also had so much trouble with my school as well, trying to prove that and appeal their decisions to medically drop my schooling. And after that, I had moved from Newfoundland to Calgary to access better healthcare services. And I began seeing a doctor, and she had identified that I needed a surgery really, really badly on my jaw to get the infection cleaned up in my jaw. And at that time, I was still struggling. I wasn't able to work because I was having trouble breathing and walking and every other thing. So my health and my well-being was declining pretty rapidly, and I noticed that this had made me more vulnerable to domestic violence. And I had a roommate for about a day, and on that day I had to call 911 because he had threatened to just inflict violence upon me. So I left right away, and I stayed in an Indigenous women's shelter. And then I had moved here to Ottawa to another Indigenous shelter as well. And finally got the surgery. And I often think about how much was lost in terms of funding for this. Like, for example, I had to go and live in a shelter a few times. The social assistance from not being able to work, medically dropping school and the cost of that. Traveling across the country to get healthcare services, when maybe if I were treated sooner, I could be more educated. I might have my degree completed with the last 2 semesters and be able to contribute to GDP. And so I wonder about how this affects so many Indigenous people, especially considering in Labrador, there's a class action lawsuit currently happening because of the systemic racism in the healthcare system towards Inuit, with Inuit having the highest levels of suicide and tuberculosis in Canada. And I know that the suicide rates are the highest in the whole world. So these health care issues genuinely impact minority groups, and especially international newcomer Canadians as well, because they often fall through gaps, systemic gaps, where they are left to be untreated medically, but also are left to fall through gaps in many other areas. And as I have been working towards anti-human trafficking, I have noticed that being able and being vulnerable to fall through these gaps really make people vulnerable to having to seek employment that is under the table type of employment, that is more in secret with a lot of dangers involved. And a lot of the times this ends up becoming human labor trafficking or human sex trafficking. And Inuit being the highest population trafficked, Indigenous people being the highest population, and newcomers to Canada as well. I noticed that when we are often just ignored, problems become way worse. And we definitely need to find solutions to these problems and give more voice to those who are affected by these very serious issues that can definitely be prevented. And I believe that climate change definitely does tie into this whole issue, as all of our relations are affected by displacement in this climate crisis, and we all have an impact. And I think that just by holding the intention of raising the consciousness and raising the vibration of and frequency of the world, I believe that we are impacting the world positively. So that's all I have to say for now.
I just have a couple of comments, but I just wanted to thank Bryanna for sharing her stories. I mean, I look differently than you, and I haven't been treated by the healthcare system in that way, right? And I think that, you know, as we think about adaptation is about adjusting our systems to our changing ways. And if we are trying to build resilient communities or implement adaptation efforts that do not fundamentally change a system that is marginalizing and excluding and oppressing people, then we have entirely missed an opportunity that we have through climate change to rethink what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so, you know, even for something like access to health, this is about investing in proactive policy, because proactive policy and preventive policy, I mean, from a plus minus point of view, which is like a bit crass, but it costs the system, it costs people way less if we are proactive than if we are trying to respond. And so, you know, I think in thinking about how climate change is intersecting with the settlement service or with healthcare or with relationship between community or our relationship to ourselves and to nature and the land and each other, we need to ensure that we are envisioning a world that we want, because sure, the systems are oppressive, but people are making decisions behind the systems, right? So we can create what we imagine the world to be. And so, I mean, I'm a cynic in a lot of ways, but I'm quite optimistic about the power of imagination and what we can dream our communities or our society to look like. And I think making sure that we are addressing these oppressive systems when we think about the adjustments that need to be made are really important. And hearing voices and getting out of the way when we need to uplift other voices that haven't been a part of the policy in the past is what we need to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely, Bryanna. Thanks very much for sharing that. You know, couple of quick thoughts. You know, I when I was younger, I worked in community mental health, and I was a community mental health worker, and I did crisis intervention, and then I had a caseload, and it always struck me that I looked at the world as opportunity, and so many of the people that I worked with didn't see opportunities. And you know, similar to your experience, Bryanna, I'd have the people I work with would call their social worker and ask for assistance and not get it. I could make that phone call and they could have that assistance the next day, right? And so, you know, I look at myself, I'm a white, older, privileged, middle-class male, and I view the world different. And it's so important for me to recognize that my reality is so different than others' realities. And to be constantly reminded of that, right? Where it's most important. And I think, Nicole, what you're saying is, how do we work within a system that obviously based on what other people are experiencing? How do we change that system? And how do we find those champions that allow us to make that change? And just listening to Cherry here, as you described, you know, one person can make a request, a simple request, getting a physician, right, with one name, and then somebody with a different name makes a request and gets a physician. That speaks to something structural, as does your experience, Bryanna. And I think we have to stop saying, you know what, blame this. We can't blame the system, because that system is made up as individuals. And how do we really tackle that? You know, I think we can make change, and I'm optimistic it doesn't happen overnight. But I mean, how do we do that in a way that allows people who are experiencing it to influence that system, so that system becomes more equitable and much more open than it needs to be than right now, right?
I would like to add to that. Thank you. I believe that that's so important as well. And I think a lot of the work might need to come from just reflecting on our own history within our countries and understanding how these systems came to be, the systems that we're currently living in and ruled by. I think it's so important to understand where all of this comes from when transitioning into a new framework or way of living in our society, and reflecting most recently on the intergenerational trauma that has been passed down through residential schools onto Indigenous people. Having my own experience with that with my own family, I realized a lot of the things that divide us within our own groups of people and our own homes, our own environments. And I think that colonization and industrialization has really caused us to become more ignorant to the idea of coming together and living in more light, more love and community. And it's separated us for the purposes of consumption. And when residential schools were made, the children who had been taken from their families didn't have parents, of course, living in these residential schools. So they didn't know how to raise their own children and were very, very traumatized by abuses that had occurred in those schools when they were children and did not have any defense to be able to protect themselves. And given that most of our programming happens at the largest rate in our brain up until 7, this really affects our way of life moving forward and how we act and live in the world and see the world. And this has definitely impacted my own parents, because my parents' parents were very traumatized and just wanted to ignore the pain and get rid of it. And this usually manifests itself through feelings of shame and guilt, which leads to addictions. And so they did not have the capacity to be there for my parents. And then my parents have that trauma and grew up in the way that they did with the parents that they had. And then that's passed down to me. So trying to understand just even how that's working within my family to be able to heal myself so that I can have more clarity and understanding of my own life path. I think it's really, really important to understand the past to be able to move forward for sure. And I think healing ourselves will really be important in being able to shift our culture into a more consciously aware mind, I guess, as a collective, and to be able to break barriers and divisive systems.
I think it's really important that these experiences, these conversations come out so that we increase awareness and we can address them. If I can ask this question of everyone, our conversation today, your work, can you tell me how you see that connecting to the settlement sector and how we support newcomers in Canada, and in particular BC?
You know, I think one of the, if we look at the settlement area, I think we're all saying we have to stop and listen to people, right? I don't think anybody on this panel saying I'm the expert, I have answers. I think we would all agree is that the audience and the people who are coming to Canada have their own unique experience. So let's not silo them, and let's not think they all have the same experience, because people do come from different backgrounds, and you know, some may come from more difficult backgrounds, some may have an easier path. Some people may have an easier path and have more difficulties than those people go through through more difficult times. So I think it's really important to recognize the diversity of people as a community and as individuals. And having said that, I think it's so important to recognize the answers have to come from them, and that it's really having them at the table, finding a chair for them, not just one time, but on that continuous basis. And then the other thing I'm sort of taking from it, and I reflect on what I've said, is recognizing they might have an entirely different worldview of my own. And again, that doesn't make it better. It doesn't make it worse. It doesn't make it confrontational. All it does is that it makes it different. And they're having that same thought as they listen to me. Oh, that guy has a totally different perspective than I do, and I don't know what to make of it. But it's having that discussion and having the respect to listen to one another. And I think if you have that, you will, and you're committed to making a positive difference, you'll always find that way, right? You will find the answers, but it's first listening and exploring and understanding. So to me, if the one takeaway from it is, let's have that discussion at the local community level, recognizing that each community and each locality won't be the same either.
Thank you, David. Actually, I think you make some very important points about bringing people to the table, and that the solutions can't be made without having the people that are affected. I know for SOICs, for instance, we know that immigrants come to Canada and they're in good health, but the longer they're in Canada, their health declines. So for us, we were really trying to find out, why is this happening? What is it that we can help to support? So recently, SOICs worked with a master's student at UBC and worked very closely with our clients to build a health literacy program. What is relevant to them, and what do they need to know, and what kind of orientation, what kind of connections need to be made. And it was interesting because we were set to roll this out, and then the pandemic hit. And at that time, there was a decision: do we go forward with this, or do we put this on hold and try again later? But we decided we have to go forward, because this is the reality of where in what the environment we're living in. And so we went forward, we went online, and it really was built in conjunction with our newcomers. And you can see from the feedback from the very first session where it was received, but it wasn't as much interaction, to the very last session where people really found value, and they were explaining that because they were part of the development of this programming. And so it is now something that we can continue to use and adapt with, like you said, with the group of people that we are speaking with, because it can change. And for the regions, because for us in the South Okanagan Similkameen, our communities are really, they range from 900 people to maybe 34,000, like in Penticton. So it really does range, and that environment and the situations do change. So I think that's a very good point where you're saying we have to involve in the solutions and the conversations the people that are affected. We need those diverse perspectives at the table. Yeah.
Can I come in for a sec? I wanted to go back to your kind of original question about how our own work or our own kind of comments intersect with the settlement service. And I think Dave has brought up some really good points about kind of the principles that need to be included when working with newcomers and things like that. But one of, like, from my own work, I think one of the things is that you know, for communities in BC, or for settlement workers who are concerned about integration and jobs and housing, those are the same kind of concerns that came up in a project I did on BC. So I did a case study of climate displacement in BC, looking at the floods and wildfires from 2017 and 2018, which you will be very familiar with. And I talked to people in emergency management and climate adaptation and in the mobility services, settlement services. And I kind of mapped what the concerns were for each group. And in the middle, the overlapping concerns were housing, jobs, vulnerabilities, and equity. And so, you know, these concerns or these issues that, you know, when I talk to people about climate displacement or climate migration, nobody in BC, that was really on their radar. It was much more kind of tangible ways in which people live their lives and feel safe and secure and in community. And so, you know, I think the way in which that all comes together around these very kind of basic human needs or components of living a life of dignity, you know. And so for people working on the displacement of British Columbians, the issues are the same as settlement workers concerned about newcomers to Canada. Like, are these people safe? Are they healthy? Do they have jobs? Do they have a safe space? And just to be a little bit provocative, you know, one of the things that I've heard over the last 10 months, because I come to this topic through a lens of justice and climate justice and social justice, about, you know, those who polluted least are most impacted by climate events. But what I have been hearing and talking to people working on this issue in the States is that it's going to be wealthy Californians or Texans or Floridians who might be coming to Canada because the conditions are changing down there, which kind of turns the justice question on its head and seems totally disconnected from settlement workers, you know, thinking about newcomer integration. But where it does come together, I think, is that settlement workers and settlement services are about building these communities, and they aren't operating in a vacuum, and there's all sorts of context and dynamics happening around. And we really need to think at a much kind of more complex, I know I people because I always want to make things more complex, but you know, at a really complex scale to understand what makes a newcomer to Canada's life rich and full and safe and them able to integrate, and how are they accessing the healthcare system, and where is their housing or their residence located, and what are the other movements in and around the province that are affecting those newcomers' access to housing or health or jobs or livelihoods. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there to come back to this bigger picture that is informing what's happening beyond the sector itself.
I would like to add to that, in terms of being concerned about things such as housing and food security, I think it's really important that the basic human needs of people be met, because having these basic human needs met equates to upholding our human rights. And I think that's so important in preventing a lot of issues, as well as crime, when there are people who are vulnerable to poverty and a lot of, I guess, just dangerous, vulnerable situations when they are coming to Canada. I also noticed that violations of human rights are at its greatest in victims of human trafficking. And that's something that's very important, I think, to look at in Canada, as we do have a really large issue with regards to human trafficking. And newcomers are a very, very high risk population to that issue. And the reasoning for this is because of the fact that they lack their basic human needs, which is housing, food security, healthcare, everything, shelter.
Maybe it's about quality of life a little bit. You know, it's interesting. Nicole, what you were saying. You know, when I did my thesis in Winnipeg, it's a long time ago, but coming from a background in psychology, you always look at coping and adjustment and how people fare with stress. And stress, of course, has an impact. But you know, when I did my research in Winnipeg amongst refugees, and then in Bangladesh, when I looked at people who've been displaced from their homes and living in squatter settlements, you know, what everybody talked about was, I'd like a job, I'd like a home, I want to make sure that my kids were fed. And when I worked in Gaza, you know, Gaza, people often have stereotypes about Palestine refugees, but you know, they wanted the same thing as everybody does. They want to have electricity, they want to have running water, they want to feed their kids, they want their kids to be able to school, they want their kids to feel safe and secure. And I think that's another part of it, is that, you know, in addition to making sure that people are at the table, it's this idea that everybody has the right to a quality of life, and everybody has the right not only to services, but services that are appropriate to them, because it's not one size fits all, right? And that lends to a sense of being safe and secure, and in fact, a decent quality of life that I think we should all be entitled to. And it's hard to imagine that, you know, in Canada with its many resources, that's not a reality for so many people.
Yeah, and I think just to like push a little bit more on that, is that this idea about, sorry, Bryanna, were you going to say something? You can go after me. That the right to services, and going back to kind of the healthcare conversation, like needs to be matched by you know, rights are something we hold, and the responsibility is with the government to ensure that our rights can be realized. And so it's a two-way street, which, you know, about the rights to basic needs, but also where are those rights coming from and how are we ensuring that they're being fulfilled? And this brings up something that I was thinking about earlier, kind of in reference to the settlement services sector, but the idea of perception and reality. And so there's been a bunch of research done around people's perception of climate change, right? Like what is happening? What does the science say? So what is the data saying? And what do people perceive to be happening? Because they are finding that in several instances, there are places where people are moving to the city and they say it's because they perceive the rainfall to be doing X, but really the rainfall is doing Y, right? And so it actually doesn't matter what the data is saying, or that there is access to healthcare in Canada. If people perceive it differently, or if people's perception is that they don't have access, or that there are barriers, or there is something lost between what the government or the agencies think is being provided and what people perceive as being provided, then we have a problem, right? We need to, and I think that's where the diversity of voices and people other than me who are reading a book about these things, you know, need to come in and say, actually, from my perspective, that's not how this plays out. I don't go to the doctor because they're racist and they don't respect me, and I wait in line and it's a waste of my time, and I have to get to my kids, or I have to get to one of my many jobs, or whatever, right? So I think the perception is also really important, and is a really important consideration for newcomers' perception of where the access points are, or where the problems to access are. So that's kind of maybe another way that these kinds of conversations are intersecting directly with the settlement groups and everyone, frankly.
I agree. I think that in terms of perception, it's really, really, really important to consider, especially when accessing different services, but also I think when regarding one another, when we are making assumptions, I guess, or judgments of one another, it's really important to keep in mind the fact that you don't fully know who they are, what their life is, or their culture sometimes, if they're of a different background. And it's always nice to keep an open mind and being flexible with those, with the way that you perceive things is really, really, I think, a great practice and a great way to learn and grow together. I also wanted to say, in terms of the respecting human rights of those who are coming to our country, it's also important to perhaps deal with the issues that already currently exist here with Indigenous peoples. And a reason I really do like BC, even though I've never been there, is that the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, has been passed there and is the only province to pass this bill. And that bill upholds Indigenous people's rights as human beings. So the fact that there's only one province in Canada that had passed that is quite concerning. And to think that Indigenous peoples are still without human rights is pretty confusing and concerning. So I think dealing with our domestic issues could really be helpful in learning how to deal with outside or new issues that will come.
Sorry, I just want to say something on that too. So one of my interviews with somebody in actually mental health, working with people who were displaced after the wildfires, talked about Canada providing international assistance when there's a tsunami or when there's an earthquake, and how many Canadians donate, and the sentiment of many of the people who had been displaced in the Caribou was that, you know, what about us? As soon as the smoke stops, all the British Columbians forget about it, all the attention stops. And so I think there is, I mean, I used to work in international development and I came back to Canada because, you know, I feel like my time could be just as well spent here as it could be in Tanzania. But that, you know, looking within and what's going on within Canada also is really important, how Canada sees itself and kind of the role that Canada plays in these bigger issues around global justice. And if we don't have, if we aren't respecting rights and respecting people and not, you know, actively oppressing or marginalizing people here, then there's a lot of work to do here before you know, looking at what we're doing beyond.
Well said. And, you know, one of the challenges, Nicole, that I find from international work to the work here, international work, you talk about, and when we talk about access to services, it's access or you know, rights to services which are presented in a dignified and respectful manner, which are culturally sensitive and so forth. When you look at the work internationally, that's always, it's always forefront in many cases, right? I don't hear the same language in my work here. And I'm sure, I think we're talking, you know, we're sort of preaching to the converted in this conversation. I think we all understand the importance of it. But I think that's part of that language. That language has to be part of that discussion. It has to be a part of the lexicon. And we should be using it in the same sentence. And I think that changes awareness and consciousness, and it puts a whole different dimension on what we're trying to achieve. We're not, you know, the end result isn't a service, it isn't an object, it's a service that is developed in consultation and is relevant to the person's needs, but perspectives, and is presented in a dignified and respectful way. I think that's a real challenge to build that part of it into the discussion. And that's as important as giving something. It's how you give something. It's not what you give, right?
So I think as we're talking right now, I'm seeing more and more of the complexities involved. on this issue. And as I mentioned before, this really is the start of the conversation. But for us, we're getting close to the end of our conversation. So I want to put this question out to all of you. What do you wish you had known before starting the work that you are doing now?
I think, well, and this might be like a slight dodge of the question, but for me, you know, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And it's sitting in that uncomfortable space of not knowing and not purporting to have the answers where I think you can learn the most. And so, you know, I think this year has been so tumultuous for so many people. But one of the things that I think has really come out from like the Black Lives Matter movement and the Wet'suwet'en, I mean, you know, at the beginning of 2020, Australia was on fire. The Wet'suwet'en were protesting. The pipelines were being protested across the country. This has been a very kind of eye-opening year, I think, for a lot of people. And sitting with the discomfort that a lot of work needs to be done and that we don't have all the answers, I think is a good starting place to try to get some of those, or get those conversations going, or have discussions like this. So I can't say there's one thing I wish I knew, but I wish maybe that I was more comfortable being ignorant about some things, or not having the knowledge, and using that time in that space to be more open about other worldviews or other ways of seeing or doing or understanding. Because I think that's where the real kind of progress, both like within me and my heart and my soul and my mind and my spirit, happen, but also in terms of my relationships to other people and to the land and to the space and place of people around me.
Nicole, thanks for taking one for the team. I'll just build on that because, you know, I had the same sense now, and even more so. And I think the discussions are more complex and are more, or have more detail and have much more depth now than 20 years ago. And I think that speaks to progress because we're learning more and we need to be looking at things a different way. But it also means that we need to be listening more closely and understanding that. So, you know, just between our own discussions, and I also teach a course, and the course is on mental health, psychosocial programming in international settings. And I'm always amazed by the different perspectives that the learners are bringing, and how relevant it is to something that I think is straightforward. So I think what you sort of explained is, what would you like to know when you first started? That resonates to me even more so now, is that the discussions, and Bryanna, the work that you're doing, and Nicole, that you're doing as well, has so much depth, and the world has changed. And I think it's so important. And I referenced myself earlier as like a white, middle-class, older male who's privileged, huh? It's so important to sit back and go, wait a minute, I really have to pay attention. I really have to learn, because I still want to contribute. I still want to be relevant. But the only way I'm going to be relevant, really, is to understand what is happening, right? And take stock and listen and open the door and be part of that process. So I don't think that changes. And I think sometimes it's even more important to sort of pause, listen, and learn from what is happening around oneself, regardless of how long you've been in a profession or your age or your own perceived level of knowledge, which may be high or low, depending on your perspective, right? But, you know, sometimes you just get outdated if you don't listen.
For me, it would be understanding the impact that I actually have, or that I matter, as somebody who's doing this work, because I often really downplay myself, or I can get really down on myself and my confidence. And I think that has come from a lot of the experiences that I had. All of the things that I speak on are things that I have had some experience with. And I would often get in a lot of trouble for advocating, still do, and targeted. And I do get in trouble for being very different. And I guess I'd always blame it on my ADHD, but yeah, that's always been something that's been difficult for me to deal with. I really appreciate my differences, but at the same time, it can cause a little trouble here and there. So I just wish I knew my impact and knew more about who I am. And I guess the fact that there would be more support with regards to the movements that are currently happening and the changes that are being made. So that's my answer.
So I think I kind of want to share as well as you have. For me, what I find is that similar to Bryanna, it's the impact. Quite often when people ask what my experience is growing up in the Okanagan, which I will say it is primarily white. Growing up, there were only 5 Filipino families, and I knew every single one of them. And so often when people would ask, what is that like? I would go to the easier conversations. It kept it light, and there was not as much conflict. So I would talk about how people would ask me to translate for the new student coming from El Salvador on the other side of the world from the Philippines. So very different. But I would say I wish I had known my impact growing up, because it does make a difference, and it's so important to have that voice at the table. And I think Nicole, you had mentioned as well, is being okay with discomfort. This year has been very difficult, a lot of challenges. Many things have been happening with the pandemic, with the Black Lives movement. And I've been asked to speak at different events regarding racism. And it's interesting because several times over this period, I've been told that, Cherry, it's good to talk about this, but maybe don't say that because people will be uncomfortable. And that has motivated me because it is important to be uncomfortable. Racism, discrimination, it's not a topic to be comfortable with. You have to get to that place of discomfort to recognize what's happening and to really be motivated to do something. That avoidance of discomfort really allows racism, discrimination, and a lot of these other issues to thrive. So for me, learning about my impact and circle of influence, and also making sure that those diverse voices at the table are really important. And I'm so happy to hear that come through this conversation today. And so if there's anything else, did anyone want to add anything before we wrap up today?
I would just want to say Black Lives Matter and land back. And that's all I would like to say. Thank you. And I really appreciate being in all of your presence. I'm so grateful, as well as the audience's presence. I'm just really happy to be here.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, for starting that conversation. I think it's really important that within the settlement sector, we keep this conversation going and really address the issues that we're seeing. David, sorry, was there something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to echo Bryanna's sense of appreciation and thanks to everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome back, Cherry, Bryanna, Nicole, and Dave. How did you feel revisiting your conversation?
It's always interesting listening to oneself. So yeah, it's not my favorite activity, but I did recall much of the discussion, and just sort of the four of us coming together from all different perspectives and never having spoken, but just so many similarities around the importance around, human rights and the importance of people and the importance of looking at others' perspectives. So that's what really struck me and going forward, that part of that discussion about how do you work together, I think it really illustrates that it's important to do, and it's certainly very possible, and there's more similarities than differences.
Yeah, I agree. And also, I mean, I echo Dave's kind of the difficulty of watching yourself after not seeing it, but how diverse, I mean, how wide ranging the conversation was, right? And so, the topic is climate change and environmental racism, but that you can't talk about those things in isolation from all of the other things that are going on. So yeah, it was fun to have that conversation, and I'm happy to answer questions. So thanks.
I had a great time. I just forget what the question was. I'm so sorry.
Well, that's good. I just thought I would kind of bring us back to the present moment, because the conversation happened in the past, and we have you all here again today to now discuss that conversation and share ideas. So I just thought I'd give you a space to say, how did that feel?
It felt really nice. I felt very safe and respected within the conversation, and I really felt that there was just a lot that I learned as well, and I felt very grateful to be in the presence of everyone. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'd like to just echo that as well. I feel really grateful that I had the opportunity to be part of that conversation. As I mentioned before, it's not something that's really being talked about right now in the settlement sector, but yet it is a part of what we're doing. It influences other areas and impacts it. So it really is a start, this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it continuing beyond this day.
Okay, thanks, Cherry. So I thought I would give a little summary of some of the, I think, key themes that come out of the conversation. I did that in the description of this event, but what really stands out to me is the importance of the need to give power to and to elevate and uplift Indigenous voices in this conversation. And so again, thank you, Bryanna, so much for being with us, because we've learned so much from you, and there was a lot of learning for us to do and unlearning. And so that's really important. That stands out to me as a number one piece. I've also noticed that there's this key need to examine, as you mentioned, Bryanna, our current systems, or the past, our current systems of how we do things in order to move forward to change. And so a couple of the questions that are in the Slido, which we'll get to, they're very much about this change, this word that I used at the beginning, EACT, right? The Musqueam Hunkaminam word. So I think we'll be able to dig into that a little bit more as well. How do we make that change? The other key theme that I noticed and was racism is also environmental. So that really came through for me. And it was very eye-opening to hear you all talk about how that manifests and suggestions for how we can move away from that. And the other piece is about the balance. And Dave, you said this nature is here for us idea and perspective versus we are here to help nature. And that comes back to your land back project that you talked about, Bryanna. And you said something really profound as well on that. And you said that this project is not about the idea of possession, getting the land back to possess it, but nobody owns the land. And it is ours to protect. And in that hour, I think that's all of us. And it comes, there's that real tie-in with what you just said, Dave, as well, that we're here to help nature, and that it's great for us to move into those ways of thinking nature's for us, let's use it, let's abuse it, but we're here to help nature and it's ours to protect. So I really liked that theme and message that came through your talk. and also the links to healthcare. This is a really a prominent piece of, I think, what you discussed, and how there are opportunities to adapt our efforts, and just also do self-reflection. And Dave, you spoke about this you did some self-reflection and made that outward to us in some of what you said. And I think that's an important question for everyone to consider going forward too. You know, how might I be thinking about my power and privilege, and how can I contribute and make change in all of this? And what is my role in the work that I do in the settlement and integration sector? So I think that's a good segue to come back to this. This actually is the first question that I'm going to ask all of you who are with us today, just to get some of your opinions and inputs as well before we move into this. And that is, what are some of the ways that you and your organization are giving sovereignty and power to Indigenous voices? We know that Cherry said at SOIX they have an Indigenous educator, and that's one of the ways that they're learning from and engaging that voice. And what are some of the ways that you and your organization give voice to newcomers in the issues discussed? Because it seems like, again, a central theme is voices and hearing from those voices that are not always at the forefront and where they should be in some of these issues. So I'm putting these questions in the chat here. So it would be great as we move forward to also get everyone who's on the call with us or who's on the meeting with us, get your ideas about how you're doing this in your organization, because this could be a really useful sharing opportunity for us, not only to hear from the speakers, but for you to engage with each other. So feel free to post the answers to those questions in the chat. But this question is quite big. It's the #1 question in the Slido right now, and it's, how do you view the role of the settlement sector moving forward in regards to climate migration? So I know you all talked about this in many ways. What's the settlement sector doing? How can the settlement sector do more? You talked about the voices, but how do you view the role of the settlement sector moving forward? What else can we do, or what do we need to do more of in regards to climate migration? This could be, again, at the local level. I'm not sure if this question refers to locally, or if it's referring to nationally in terms of policy and things like that, where maybe, Nicole, you might want to speak more about the policy side of things. But it'd be really great to hear from you all on this question, and maybe expand on your ideas on how can we move the settlement sector forward in regards to climate migration.
So that's a great question, and I actually spent some time interviewing people in the settlement service when I was doing interviews last year for my dissertation, and asking them how they thought their organization kind of was thinking about or was dealing with the intersections of climate change and mobility. And most of what I heard is that it's just starting to come up, and most organizations haven't really been thinking about it. But the other thing that I heard, and I think is where I'll kind of use as my starting point, is that the role of the settlement services is really about providing services in BC for newcomers. And so one of the things that I would suggest, or kind of respond to this question, is that for Canada, it is really, for anywhere, it's very difficult to identify climate migration as a self-contained phenomenon, right? And so in my opening comments, I talked about how climate change intersects with diverse drivers of migration. And so what I'm trying to do with my thinking and with my project is that the framing around this is really important. And so you could even drop the qualifier climate from that question, even though this is about environmental change and environmental racism and climate change, because all of our movement is now in the context of a changing climate. What is a specific kind of movement in response to climate change, which has always happened, is disaster displacement, right? So things like big hurricanes or floods or wildfires in BC, abroad or at home, that displace people in kind of an acute sense that might be temporary or longer term or whatever. But in terms of the settlement sector's role, I think, a big part of the settlement sector's role is for integration here in BC. And it doesn't necessarily matter how or why people came, right? And so some of the questions I asked when I was interviewing people is that, does your organization advocate with the feds or with IRCC? And I heard that, there's kind of a tricky relationship when their funding is coming from IRCC to be in an advocacy position. But I think one of the things to think about is that Canada is not going to see an influx of people because of climate change, just because of the way our policies are set up now and because of how geographically isolated we are. But Canada can be proactive and progressive in terms of policy at the international level or engaging in international forums, just as we can be proactive here at home in terms of thinking about how displacement from floods and wildfires in BC intersects with settlement providers' concerns such as housing or jobs, right? So if people are displaced in and around Kamloops and they temporarily, sometimes for a longer term, flood into Kamloops, how does that impact settlement service work in terms of housing availability for newcomers or things like that? So that getting away from this kind of climate change causes migration, what do we do? And understanding in a much broader context is, I think, a good place to start for the settlement sector. But I don't have, you guys should be doing this, this, and this. I think part of what came up in the conversation is that this is a conversation that we need to start having, and we also need to be having it with people who are impacted. So both possibly people who are displaced temporarily or with newcomers themselves. And so even just going back to what Julie said, I was involved in a talk with Care Canada, and one of the things they did is they said, we will never host another event without having they were working on refugee stuff. We will never have another event without a refugee's voice as part of our activity. And so really bringing in the voices of people who are on the ground who know, I think is a good place to start.
Yeah, that makes me think too about language. I mean, in my role as the language program coordinator supporting settlement language training organizations, that's a question I have. In what way can we bring in newcomers' voices when they don't always feel comfortable connecting in English? And the most obvious solution, I think, is that there are language-specific opportunities for them to speak in their comfortable language or their mother language. I wonder how easy is that, or how difficult is that to do, Cherry? Do you have ideas about what you've been able to do as a settlement organization and where it's difficult to make some of these movements forward or to add in some of these support services? I wonder if you have some other thoughts to add to that Slido question in response to Nicole as well.
So in terms of I'll speak about what we do now when we're looking and what we experience here in the Okanagan. The displacement here it's temporary. It's usually in response to wildfires, and people are temporarily displaced. So as a settlement organization, our link instructors, our settlement workers, our role there is really making those connections, because you're in a situation where there's sometimes panic. What do I do? Where do I go? So we're trying to get the information out there and simplify it, always putting it in simplified English and really directing them to reliable sources of information. We saw this too during the pandemic, where there was so much misinformation out there and confusion. So we really had to bring everything together, um, and simplify, make sure it's being sent out really clear and simplified English, and directing people to reliable sources of information, and helping them to recognize what is reliable and what is misinformation. So that's where a really big role for us was, especially during wildfires. How do I report and check in as an evacuee? Where are the centers? Where do I go online? Where can I go to find housing, water, food? All that information is, I think, our role in settlement is getting it, it exists in the community, but newcomers may not necessarily know where to find that because they're not even aware it exists in some cases. So that's one area I think we can make an impact in when it comes to temporary displacement. But when it comes to kind of that bigger picture, I think it's been said throughout our conversations, we talked about getting voices at the table. And I mentioned I really wish I had known that impact I could make if I had got into those conversations earlier on, that I got uncomfortable and I shared those experiences. So I think with our settlement workers, we all have our networks. We sit at different tables, different community networking, planning tables. So it's important to have that that representation. Being in smaller centers, in more rural and remote locations, I'm quite often one of the very few visible minorities, if not the only one. When we started having conversations about racism, I heard from many clients who come forward and they share their stories. And like you say, they're not always in a position where they can voice it themselves because they fear losing their job. They fear some type of retribution to themselves or to their family. So I think us being in the settlement sector, we do have our network. We do have these this area of influence where we can bring those voices forward in the work that we do. And that situation where I talked about access to healthcare, we were in a conversation with, for example, the Rotary, and there were people there that are involved with healthcare, and they were not aware that this was happening. And it's not it could be completely unconscious bias where someone looks at a name and says, "Oh, I'm not sure how to say this," and then suddenly you've created this inequality. So bringing that awareness so that we recognize this even happening is a start, so that we can start talking about the solutions and bringing people into the conversation when we have the opportunity.
Hi, this is Dave. Can I just build on Sherry's example? You know, one of the things I do as part of my job is emergency management, and we work with emergency social support services and provide psychosocial support. And what you're saying is how there are different populations that we need to be supporting. And if you look at how do you support a population in the aftermath or during an emergency, you're looking, that might be one area that you identify as a priority. So I think going forward with anything is looking at what are the implications for newcomers and what are those priorities that could be moved forward. I think the other key thing is part of that process is looking at what are the opportunities for engagement. And if you can identify somebody who says, hey, that's important, we're going to listen and we can move it forward, I think it may not be your number one priority, but it may well get balanced out when you look at the opportunity to engage other stakeholders that allows you to move it forward. And then that last bit, I think, is the willingness to make an investment, perhaps not in money, but in time and energy, because it's one thing to identify, another thing to identify your partner. It's that third thing is to keep that moving and often to give it to give it a nudge. And the best way to nudge things is to take some responsibility and make that happen. So I would just add on to that. I think there's opportunities though, and what you just identified, in terms of emergencies, how do we best support different populations? Certainly that's one priority that I'm also hearing as well.
Thanks, Dave. It feels like in a way you've also answered this next one of these other questions in here, which is that the comment in question is, these are good conversations within the settlement service, but what can we do to make management, boards of directors, executive directors, give more value to settlement's role in climate change, or in the supports required to support those with displacement as a result of climate change locally here. So I feel like you've addressed a little bit of that. And this question and comment also connects to what I thought of when you, Dave, were responding to the discussion on requesting or trying to get a physician for a health ailment. And you said that it's important for you to remind yourself of your reality and your privilege. And I wondered, when you were speaking about that, how does this process or move to reflection happen? And how might that be balanced with, an ED or board of directors vision of what an organization can do to emphasize, this work? How can we communicate? Like, let's say we are being reflective and we are aware of what we can do in order to move this conversation forward, but it gets tricky when you ask about, how can I make someone else do something, right? Whether it's a higher up or someone that you're supporting. So that's the next question I'd like to put to you. I wonder if anyone else would like to add to that, because I know, Dave, you kind of spoke to that just a bit now.
Real quick, I think that for management, I think they could implement new frameworks that include more, I guess, more inclusivity and diversity and less racism, because like we had spoken about in terms of the healthcare issues and the one experience that I had with having to travel to different places, I think about the amount of resources that were used in that time, when if there were less prejudice towards me, perhaps I would have been able to get healthcare sooner, which would have changed a lot of things in terms of the use of resources and sustainability of that.
Yeah, it's something that came up in the conversation that you had said too, Nicole, right, about the cost of being responsive versus this cost of being responsive instead of proactive.
Yeah, I mean, that comes out of disaster risk reduction, emergency management, healthcare. I mean, across the board, generally proactive policies save money as opposed to the cost of responding. But the sense that I get from these questions, and kind of building on what Dave was saying about opportunity for the sector perhaps to make their case of their importance or of their value. And I said previously, for me, climate change and migration are a very tricky intersection, but they are something that are increasingly talked about. It's increasingly in the news. Biden just announced that the US is going to think about resettlement for climate displacement. And so I wonder if this is also an opportunity in a bigger climate, in a broader context, I won't say climate, in a broader context where there is increasing anti-immigrant sentiment around the world. How does the settlement sector use the concept or the understanding of climate migration as a way to like assert their value or reassert their position or their worth, and so that while people might be less willing to accept more immigrants or more refugees, by showing the value of the work that's done in integrating people and newcomers into Canada and how valuable that is for Canadian society, perhaps that is a way to, to position themselves in this broader discussion of the potential increased movement of people. Because, I mean, Canada could bring in, tens of thousands of more people or hundreds of thousands. I know there's people who want 100 million or something like that, but using the framing that's out there, using the concept that's out there about climate migration or climate displacement to say, this is the value of our work. This is what we're doing. This is how we're even working with our local communities or our Indigenous communities. This matters. This is going to matter more in the future, and trying to kind of position the sector in an even more valuable way than it already is, because of the bigger context of change. Yeah, I don't know if I'm trying to really get at the core question around what specifically could the sector do.
Yeah, well, and you're making me think too about, Nicole, about data, and I wonder, do you have recommendations for where people can go to access some data on this, right? Through your work with the Center for Global Studies, or your work with the Migrants and Climate Migrants and Refugee Project, for example, or other great places for organizations to source some of that data and to support, the services they're offering and the importance of them.
There is no data on the number of climate migrants or the number of people crossing borders because of climate change or disasters, but there is an organization called, and I can put the link in the chat, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, because we know that the majority of displacement from climate change is internal. And when you look at that data, you don't see a clear trend line going up over time, because displacements happen, or the volume of displacement really happens depending on population and the severity of the event, right? So even though for a researcher, it would be great to show, oh, look, over the past 10 years, displacements are getting way worse. We need to be more proactive. That's not, if there's a big event in China or Bangladesh or India, the numbers are massive. If there's a big event in the Caribbean, the numbers aren't as big because there's just less people there, right? But that is kind of the data place for, and they have numbers on Canada. They do an annual report, but there is no reporting or data around what do we know about people moving internationally. And I started my PhD thinking that I was going to be asking about the role that climate or environmental change played in newcomers to Canada's migration pathway. And nobody is going to say, after a bit of digging, first, I wanted to sidestep that causal question because it kind of misunderstands migration, but also because so few people say it was climate change or the environment. It was family or economy or economics or, the well-being of their kids or the opportunity of a better, safer life in Canada. So I decided I didn't want to go down that hole of trying to isolate climate. So that's the data is a problem, is a real problem for understanding this. And even within British Columbia, sorry, I'll end on this, is that, we knew that the numbers say 65,000 people were displaced from the wildfires in 2017, but there has been no follow-up on, did everybody go back? How long were people displaced for? Most of it was temporary, or it was like to relocation centers. But even in BC, that has, pretty robust capacity for data and statistics relative to other places around the world. We don't know. We don't have the data on that.
I think, when we look at sectors in climate change or any issue, it can really be big, right? And that becomes overwhelming really quickly. But I think there's also opportunities that are presented to us immediately. And I don't think we always take them. You know, when I worked for the federal government, I used to go out and I speak at conferences, and I actually had a budget that if somebody came towards me, I'd be happy to look at projects. And I would talk to 200 people and nobody ever came. And I think it's really important to look at what can we do now. So, you know, Charlie, and based on what you were saying about, can we do more to make sure that communities and newcomers are aware of what to do during emergencies and how best to support them. If we wanted to have a conversation afterwards and bring in individuals that we talked about, right? Like, let's have a different voice at the table. We could certainly do that. And I could invite, you know, Canadian Red Cross, other people might be interested. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. We shouldn't lose sight of the big goal, but we should look at, can we do something now that is beneficial and can make a small difference? And, you know, once you add up those small differences, it gets someplace. So I think it's always important to look at what can we do today, however small it might seem, in comparison to what we want to achieve at the end of the day.
All right, well, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add, Cherry or Bryanna, to this question, but if not, then I'll move on to the next one. But that question again that we started off with was about the management piece and having management board of directors see the value. Just to come for a full circle on that one.
If I can just add, we talked a lot about data, and the reality is we're a society that needs the data to go forward quite often. And I'm going to relate it back to racism. Being in smaller communities, I've been in many dialogues where, and our settlement workers have heard lots of narratives of incidences of racism and discrimination, and they're shared quite often at these different tables in the community. Yet it's so easy that we found for the community to ignore or to brush it off, because most of this information is anecdotal. They're not reported. So one area is really taking a look at your community and kind of getting that snapshot. So in terms of racism, what we're doing here at SOICS is we're reaching out not just to our clients, but to the broader community with a survey. We want to know what's going on. We need to, before we could go forward, before we could get people to support and to buy in, we're really seeking to get that data and to present it and show them that, you know what, this is not a problem just south of the border to our neighbors. It's a very real problem here in our communities. And the danger here is that because it's not so obvious that we don't have this data, that we can ignore it and brush it off. So I guess what I'm saying is really trying to keep bringing those voices in, recording all those narratives somewhere so that we can share and bring forward these voices and then bring them to the table when possible.
The organization, the NGO Climate Migrants and Refugees project that I was working with in Vancouver, one of the things that they have been kind of working on or trying to build up kind of curriculum around capacity is around bringing a displacement lens into your work, so that understanding how displacement, I think for settlement workers in BC, it might be displacement of in BC, intersects with the other dimensions or elements of your programming or your policies or whatever, so that, you know, thinking about a 5-year strategic plan or something like this, how would a major wildfire or flood in this region impact, you know, our programs or our policies, or where do the majority of our kind of clients or our like service recipients live, you know, trying to think about, okay, if we take seriously that we're living in a very dynamic climate, even in BC, what does that mean for programs, policies, housing locations, jobs, livelihoods, things like that, moving forward? And how is that gonna look in 10 years?
So there's another question here, which is how can immigrant services be more involved with Indigenous communities? Who will likely be impacted by climate change in the most in Canada? Oh, okay, so Indigenous communities who will likely be the most impacted by climate change. So yeah, how can immigrant services be more involved with Indigenous communities? And I know you're working with Indigenous climate action, and that's how we connected with you, Bryanna. I wonder if you wanted to maybe speak to that, or also like how can we make shifts in our own mindsets, you know, as well about the changes required to have to move to this like notion of even protection over possession. So I wonder if you could speak to those things a little bit before we wrap up.
I am not entirely sure how to answer this question, but I will try my best. Ways in which an organization that I work for called Tunisivinga Inuit, I work there in the Aluyarnik program, which means stepping forward in Inuktitut. And that is the anti-human trafficking department. And in that department, my boss, she's a Black woman and Indigenous as well. And there are other women who come from other countries who are Indigenous to those countries that I work with too, who have a very broad and very, I guess, well-rounded understanding of how people are discriminated against and how violations of human rights amongst people can really affect the way in which people carry out their lives. And these human rights violations often in people of color, Black and Indigenous communities can be really devastating and dangerous. But understanding those commonalities and coming together has been really healing, especially within that workplace. And even though we come from different places around the world, we do have commonalities in what we do experience. And we can build resilience in those ways of coming together and being able to meet other people who have similar experiences, especially when dealing with hard things that are hurtful, like discrimination or racism. It's really nice to be able to have a safe space to talk about it with people who really, really understand. And then I feel that like being able to do that, you can break a lot of barriers and isolation. And I think sometimes that's what's really affecting so many people is that isolation, even if it's in terms of mental health, they might not even understand what's going on or hurting them, but coming out of that isolation really brings a lot of people together, and I think is much more sustainable in that way too. So I think it's very possible to work together. I think it would be great.
Well, I certainly hope that we can continue the conversation with you, Bryanna, moving forward on this and can keep the connection going, even though you are 3 hours away. I think that it's been really great. It's been great to have you as part of this. And as I said, I've learned so much, and thank you for that response. So we are at the end of the time for our AMSSA talk today. So we won't have time to answer any more questions, but thank you, Nicole, for putting a response in the chat to the question on should Canada create a specific category to accept refugee claims based on climate impact. So there's a little quick response there for the person who asked that. And yeah, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of our speakers. It's been so great to have you. And yeah, I really want to thank you, Dave, Bryanna, Nicole, and Cherry for being here with us. And I would also like to thank the funder for this event, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. And of course, to thank you all for attending. Thank you for sending in your questions. And thank you very much to the AMSSA team who supported the production of this event. And Yeah, we also have an info sheet, just to reiterate, on climate change, displacement, and environmental racism. And you can find it on the AMSSA webpage. I will also be sending the link of the info sheet to you with an email that includes the evaluation for this event. We would love to hear from you to find out what you thought and how we can, what kinds of topics you'd like us to focus on for future AMSSA talks. So again, thank you so much, Bryanna. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Nicole. Thank you so much, Cherry, for all your efforts and inputs into the talk. And have a great day, everyone.